Hello, my amazing friends. This is Katy Gostaspi, and here is chapter 1, read by myself, of my latest book. Long time in the works, not because the content wasn't there and ready to go, but because I was just a little nervous about sharing it. This book is called Emotional Resonance Factor, A Portal to Self-Love in 4 Steps. And I wrote it because I was really looking to support humanity in the professional sector, to be more self-expressed, fulfilled, successful, the better version of themselves, each executive and each person. I can't work with everyone else as their executive coach and their consultant, and I wanted this for everyone. Specifically, it's almost like my love letter to women professionals, because I think as a woman professional to another woman professional, supporting women professionals allows everyone in the corporate world to flourish and grow. And then the home life is better too. So it's a win-win. So here's chapter 1, literally read to you from the screen, fresh off the presses. And I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1, Confused and Unsteady. As a child growing up in Iran, even being a minority religion, as Zoroastrians, I remember an easier childhood than most. We had money by the time I was born. My parents, older sister, and I lived close to my grandparents, and we had a full and busy life as a family. I recall the fun and festive Persian New Year's, Nowruz, filled with sweets, new clothes, and a beautiful springtime in Tehran. I recall a weekend at my grandmother's and grandparents' estates in Fasham, just on the outskirts of Tehran. Growing up in Iran was great, until one day it wasn't. Some may say that's where the root of my traumatic experiences started. I'd say there was some everyday family trauma before the unrest in Iran started, but nothing like what happened in 1979. Overall, the 1979 political revolution was confusing to me as a young child. I had the same thoughts any 6-year-old would have. I didn't understand that everything was politically motivated. What I did understand was the idea of peace versus unrest. I simply didn't understand why people couldn't get along. I didn't like the fear I felt watching my parents and extended family talk about what was to come. My parents were arguing more than they felt the stress of what was to come. I felt lost and unclear. As a 6-year-old, I felt scared, not knowing if I'd be taken care of. The Iranian Revolution started in 1979 when I was 6 years old. I remember hearing my parents and grandparents discussing what we should do. The belief was that all the political unrest would die down, quote unquote, soon. Little did we know soon meant some version of, quote unquote, never. My family decided to send me, my mom, and my grandmother to the United States to stay for 2 weeks with my mom's 2 brothers in Indiana. My older sister was already abroad and had stayed there since our previous visit the year before. My dad stayed at home in Iran. After all, he had a career and we had multiple homes to protect. We packed 2 suitcases and drove to the airport. It was evening and the streets were dark. I remember driving by the Coca-Cola factory on our way to the airport. As we drove by, I saw the factory on the left side of the road had been set on fire because it was American. The fire was blazing hard as we drove by on our way to the airport. I was terrified and confused. I had never been that close to a large fire. Where were we going? Why was the world on fire? Why wasn't my dad coming with us? As a scared and confused 6-year-old, I had so many questions and no one was giving me answers. My dad had spent over 10 years growing up and attending university in Germany, so he was fluent in the German language. When we arrived at the airport, we headed straight to the Lufthansa ticket counter to purchase 3 tickets for my grandmother, my mom, and me. As we stood in line, I was horrified at the crowds and angry German nationals yelling in German. I would later discover that these German nationals were yelling because they wanted to get out of Iran, given the unrest. When we got to the front of the line at the ticket counter, my dad conversed fluently in German with the ticket agent to get us on the next flight out of Tehran through Germany to the United States. After we purchased the tickets, there was yelling by those in line behind us at the women working the Lufthansa ticket counter. Why were they yelling? Why was everyone so angry? My dad would later translate for us what was happening. It seems we had bought the last 3 tickets on the final flight out of Tehran that night. The people in line behind us were angry German nationals, protesting that it wasn't right to allow 3 Iranians to buy tickets out of Tehran when they, being German citizens, wanted out of Tehran on their own national airline. My father further translated that the Lufthansa gate agent responded to the angry crowd in line behind us. She said that she was following the rules to be fair. We had been next in line. That was my first conscious experience of discrimination. For years, I couldn't tell that story without tearing up. I was emotionally moved, not just because we were discriminated against by the people in line behind us. I was emotionally overwhelmed by the fairness and honesty of the German gate agent who sold us the tickets. I often wondered what my life would be like today if the German gate agent hadn't been fair, or if they'd actually run out of seats when we got to the front of the line. Little did I know how my life would change forever, being displaced as a refugee in a new foreign country. Little did I know of the changes, struggles, lessons, relationships, and the journey that was coming my way. Being an immigrant on its own may have been the largest and most traumatic experience of my life. I rarely felt like I fit in. Before moving to the U.S., I was a more self-expressive, fun kid. I used to love talking and entertaining my family. Even then, a common theme in my life was the pain of being misunderstood. I always felt I was so much more expressive than the rest of my family. What was wrong with laughing, dancing, and putting on plays? Why was it not okay to speak up? Somewhere around 3 years of age, I remember consistently being told to be quiet and to sit still. But I had so much to share and so much fun to express. Why was it that I wasn't allowed to self-express? Didn't they understand how important it was for me to share who I was? I felt frustrated and confused. I started dimming my light as a childhood response to my mom and sister. It was my decision to make, not my mom nor my sister's quote-unquote fault. They were not harming me in any way. At that time, being 3 years old, it felt like the right and only decision I could make in order to ensure they both would want to keep taking care of me. Looking back, no small child would choose otherwise. Dimming my life left me feeling safe. It also left me feeling very alone and neglectful of my own needs and desires. Being a child new to the United States, I felt awkward and different. Different is a very sad place to be as a child. No child wants to be different. Different equals excluded, which feels lonely. I remember it almost felt intolerable. This process of not fitting in led me to dim my light even more. I didn't want to make others around me feel stupid or bring attention to how different I looked or how differently I approached life. So I kept my capacity and self-expression to myself. I played along to fit in and make others more comfortable around me. This process made sense to me as a 6-year-old in a new country, facing trauma and turmoil, internal and external. It served a purpose. Flash forward 40 years, 2 gurus, countless self-improvement courses, and several therapists later, I came to realize that the 3 to 6-year-old me was still dominating my 40-something years with this process and mindset. Being misunderstood and frustrated continued. Because I had short hair as a child, everyone used to mistake me for a boy. This would really make me angry. When I was 5 years old, I got my ears pierced. Once my ears were pierced, when anyone mistook me for a boy, I was quick to speak up for myself, lamenting, "I am not a boy. I am a girl. Can't you see my earrings?" Adversity has become one of my greatest teachers and one of the best accelerants of my life and goals. Like most others, I used to detest adversity. The friction that came about because of adverse circumstances and people would be too much for me to handle. That was the case until one day I did a complete reframe on the subject. Most of us have gone through our fair share of adversity. We could all write volumes of books on the subject, in fact. Nothing prepares you for adversity like being uprooted from your life and home and starting over again in a completely different foreign place without knowing the language nor customs. Being an immigrant eventually taught me to be flexible and find comfort in being different by seeing myself as special in my own eyes. Not fitting in was an odd experience, to say the least. Not only was it confusing to be in a new place, but it was unsettling to find that everything was different. New language, new foods, new customs, new environment, new bed, new everything, most of which I knew nothing about. The first time I tasted peanut butter, I was shocked and disappointed. Every kid at school seemed to be in love with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I was sure peanut butter would taste amazing, and it didn't. I wanted to fit in, but I just hated peanut butter as a kid. It was impossible to swallow. Madness. Fast forward 40-some years later, and I love peanut butter. The shift I experienced with peanut butter could serve as a good metaphor for my evolution as an immigrant. I remember the day a few months after being in the United States that my mom and sister decided it was time for me to start first grade. I remember being taken to elementary school and being put into Mrs. Off's first grade class. I can still vividly see in my mind's eye the door to the first grade classroom being closed behind me, leaving me all alone with my new classmates and teacher. There was a small window in that door. I recall looking back towards the door and seeing my mom and sister staring into the room through the tiny window. They looked so worried. I was so worried. With my eyes, I communicated disbelief that they were leaving me alone with these strangers who spoke a different language. I remember sitting down at my new desk in class. Suddenly, class started with all the kids jumping out of their seats and putting their hands over their hearts. They all started to mumble the same words in unison. I was so confused. I couldn't even ask anyone in class what they were doing because I didn't speak English. Later, I discovered they were all reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Mrs. Off tried her very best to teach me her last name. She would say her last name, quote unquote, off, and then switch on and off the lights in the classroom. At first, I had no idea what she was trying to convey to me. Why does she keep turning the lights on and off? Was it ever going to get clearer and easier? The notion of not fitting in just continued for me as a kid. Growing up in Indiana was a blessing in many ways. Midwesterners are kind and open-hearted. But kids are kids, and when you don't look like all the other Indiana kids, you feel bad, and the other kids can make you feel even worse. I remember always being pulled in opposite directions. On one hand, I loved being an Iranian, the food, the language, my family. On the other hand, I felt a need to be like the other kids, to be liked and wanted and feel worthy. I certainly didn't look like them. I didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. In fact, I had dark hair and dark brown eyes, and my skin color was olive. When we would sit down to dinner, I often didn't eat because I wasn't hungry for any food, whether that was Iranian food or American cuisine that my mom made. When I didn't eat Iranian food, my father would often say, "Katy's now American and only wants to eat hamburgers." I remember the sense of rage I felt inside every time my dad said this. I would counter back, "I am not eating because I am not hungry." I was angry that he was accusing me of losing my culture. That feeling didn't leave me for decades. I remember my first experience with being bullied for being different. I was in first grade. A girl named Julie didn't like me. She was tall, blonde, and scrawny. Julie came from a broken home. I remember her cornering me at school by the bathroom door. She blocked my path to the bathroom and told me I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom. I cowered down to her. For years, I would run that scenario repeated me in my mind. And in my mind this time, I would stand up to Julie and not be bullied. Oh, how I wish I'd done so. Another time, we were playing outside, and Julie came up to me and punched me hard in the stomach. I lost my breath. I also lost my faith in humanity a little bit that day. Plus, I started to develop an unconscious dislike for those named Julie. To this day, I think about Julie and wonder where she is and what she's up to. To this day, I marvel that even at that young age, females have a propensity to be unkind to other females just because of differences in appearance. This pattern continues as we grow up. If we can't be represented fairly in the workplace with men, we'll have to climb over each other women to ascend to our rightful place. It didn't help either that at home I was treated with kid gloves. The circumstances of my birth made it so my mom and older sister would smother me constantly under the guise of love and doting. My sister had really wanted a playmate. She made it very clear to my parents that she wanted and was waiting for her baby sister. My mother had suffered many miscarriages after having my sister. It wasn't until she was pregnant with me that she was put on 7 months of bed rest until I was born. 7 months of bed rest. I can't even imagine what that would be like, nor can I imagine what that did for upping the stakes on me coming into this world and ensuring me sticking around in good health. I was a cute kid. I was also a frail kid. Or maybe I was raised to be frail. Regardless, my sister had wanted a companion, not competition. I had 2 mothers, given that my sister was almost 9 years older than me. I remember the first 8 years of my life being marked by high fevers and constant colds. My earliest memories are about running away from my mom and all the others she had enlisted to get me to eat. I just didn't want to eat, ever. My ribs stuck out, my arms dangled next to my skinny body, and my stomach was huge, just like my eyes were. I resembled one of the starving children in Africa you see in fundraising commercials. Aside from wanting to prevent me starving to death, my mom probably wanted me to eat so people didn't think she was starving me on purpose. While some may think I loved the attention I got being chased to eat daily, I hated it. It was very traumatic. Even as a child, all that attention struck me as obsessive and overbearing. Why did I need to eat if I wasn't hungry? Wouldn't my body tell me somehow if I really needed to eat? Even back then, I had a sense of what wellness and harmony meant for me as an individual. The doting continued. Standing at the bus stop on those cold Indiana winter mornings wasn't the same for me as for other kids. My mom would come with me to ensure I was bundled up well. I stuck out like a sore thumb for sure. First time I saw the movie A Christmas Story, I was reminded of my own winter experiences growing up in Indiana. I hated not being allowed to stand at the bus stop like all the other kids who barely had a hat on, much less had their mother there with them. I even remember one kid who would come to the bus stop with wet hair. In 10-degree weather, his hair would literally start to freeze on his head as we waited for the bus to arrive. Even as a kid, I was very empathetic, picking up on others' emotions and trying to be the peacemaker. I remember our first year in the United States was very emotionally challenging for my parents, having to leave behind all their wealth, family, careers, and life to start over. They used to argue often. As a child, I couldn't discern whether these arguments were all part of the process of starting over. I remember getting so scared when my parents fought. It was bad enough being in a new country, not speaking the language, and now my parents were fighting a lot. Nothing in my life felt stable nor safe, so I took it upon myself to make them stop fighting. Sometimes that meant intervening, Most often it meant hiding and praying in the way only a 6-year-old knows how to do. None of my tactics seemed to work. I felt more awkward, afraid, lonely, and muted. I was starting to lose my light. I was also starting to anticipate everyone else's needs and then trying to meet their needs before my own needs. Looking back, it was the only way I knew, as a 7-year-old, how to manage my life and stay safe in my own world. This eventually turned into a programmed pattern for me where I didn't want to rock the boat with anyone close to me because it was always better to not rock the boat and not create conflict than to speak up and express my needs and desires. But my earlier years in the United States weren't all sad. There was a lot of joy and novelty too. Because we left Iran with 2 suitcases, thinking we would only be in the United States for 2 weeks, when we decided to stay in the United States, I didn't have any of my toys, much less much clothing. I remember that first Christmas. I was so enamored by the idea of a Christmas tree. I was even more in awe of the fat, jolly old man dressed in red who brought me toys. I remember my uncle dressing up like Santa and handing out gifts. It was truly my first experience of joy in the United States, given all the trauma that we had endured and all the challenges and trauma yet to come. I remember my mother not wanting to buy a Christmas tree, despite all my begging and pleading. I wanted twinkly lights and a tree. After all, we weren't Christian, and that was my mother's reasoning. My grandmother convinced her daughter otherwise. My grandmother reminded my mom that as non-Muslims, we had spent a lifetime in Iran having to mourn with the Muslims. Now it was time we celebrate with the Christians, especially if I, as a little girl, got some joy from doing so. I've had Christmas trees since Christmas of 1979. However, that first Christmas tree will always remain a cherished memory of fitting into a new place and culture somehow. After that first Christmas in 1979, to the end of her life, my mother loved and celebrated Christmas with deep joy. We always managed to integrate our own Zoroastrian religion and customs during Christmas. While we put up a tree and even went to Christmas Eve Mass often, we also had classical Iranian dishes to go with the turkey. To me, that was the quintessential immigrant, flexing and adapting, yet keeping our traditions and culture. During this time of my life, I learned that my emotions were often painful. I learned that expressing my emotions was not always welcome, that being expressive in general wasn't always welcome. I was starting to learn that the only use for emotions was to trigger worry, which was the way I could stay in control and feel safe. Needless to say, none of these lessons were healthy, as they led to patterns of behavior and thinking that I would work very diligently to break and release in order to thrive, be happy, and successful. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1 of my latest book, Emotional Resonance Factor, A Portal to Love in 4 Steps. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love your comments and commentary on what you thought. And I thank you for listening to my podcast, listening to this, and I look forward to the next time we get to connect. And I look forward to you reading the whole book when it is released and sharing it with others. Until then, I hope you enjoyed the sneak peek.